So today we look at the medieval church that spans roughly 1,000 years. In the sermon I did 2 weeks ago, I did 100 years. This week we're doing 1,000 years, okay? So it's going to be a bit of a rush. And so this is the 1,000 years between the beginning of the 5th century and the 14th century. So we're going to examine a few things today. First, the political situation. What happened in Europe during these 1,000 years? And second, how did the church react through the two main branches of the church? So these two branches being monasticism and the papacy, which I'm thinking from exploring Bible knowledge, you have a sense of what we're probably going to be talking about today. So let's look first at the political history. Roughly 100 years after Constantine had worked so hard to unite the Roman Empire, in 410, Rome was sacked by the Goths, the Visigoths. The Germanic barbarians were taking over the West, so they poured in from Western Europe and set up their own kingdoms, each one operating as a feudal lord over their territory. In the east, the imperial church at Constantinople, which Constantine had established, continued for another 1,000 years until it was sacked by the Turks in 1453. And that ended Constantine's dream of a new Christian Rome. But it's the West that we're going to talk about today, and the West was surely a mess with no central leadership anymore and no peace. And it would take 1,000 years to bring about a new civilization. And this 1,000-year period is called the medieval period, or the Middle Ages, and sometimes even the Dark Ages. The barbaric invasions and the breakup of the Roman Empire left the church with two theological issues. Number one, Arianism. And this was addressed last week by Chad. You remember that controversy over the divinity and the humanity of Christ. Well, that one continued for quite some time. And secondly, paganism became an issue. The barbarian Goths were pagan and brought with them a pagan religion. So from the 5th century through to the 8th century, the church fought for the true faith, which was also called the Nicene faith after the Nicene Creed, which you may remember. Eventually, pagans and Arians converted, mostly due to the strength of the papacy and the renewal within the monastic movement. So, for the 5th and 6th century, Europe was controlled by the barbarian kings and lords. I think we have a slide that shows all of the Visigoth kingdoms sort of taking over Western Europe and down into like the bottom of the Mediterranean as well. So they pretty well took over everything. However, early in the 7th century, everything changed. Out of Arabia, a territory generally ignored by the Roman Empire, a tidal wave of conquest arose and threatened to engulf the world. First, they took down the Persian Empire and then began attacking many of the ancient Roman territories. The man behind this conquest was Muhammad, an Arab merchant who became a savvy political leader. In his dealings as a merchant, he had come in contact with both Judaism and various Christian sects that existed in Arabia. He was a deeply spiritual man who claims to have had a message revealed to him by the angel Gabriel. This message was of a single God for all people. Muhammad claimed that he was not preaching a new religion, but simply preaching the culmination of what God had revealed through the Hebrew prophets to the Jews and through Jesus to the Christians. However, he greatly deviated from the Christian faith by claiming that Jesus was only a great prophet and not the divine God, as Christians believed. 622 AD is considered the beginning of the Muslim era. And one by one, Persia, Syria, Damascus, Jerusalem, Egypt, Carthage fell to the Muslims. By 711, Gibraltar and Spain had fallen as well. Finally, the Muslims were stopped at the Battle of Tours in France in 732. There you go, all that purple? All that purple is Muslim invasion. Certainly these invasions had severe consequences for Christianity. The major centers of Christianity, Jerusalem, Antioch, Damascus, Alexandria, and Carthage, were now under Muslim rule. In North Africa, Christianity completely disappeared. In the rest of the Arab holdings, it was tolerated but ceased to grow. Until now, Christianity had been centered around the Mediterranean Sea, but with the south wiped out, Constantinople became very isolated, and Christianity centered in the northwest of Europe. So France, Italy, Britain, part of northern Spain became the focus for Western Christianity. So Western Europe lived under Muslim rule for a couple of centuries until the 10th century when more invasions began. This time it wasn't the Muslims, nor was it the barbarians. It was the Vikings, the dreaded Vikings or Norsemen, as well as the Hungarians. The Vikings came from Scandinavia and began sacking and looting England and northern France. And by the 11th century, King Canute of the Danes was master of all England, Denmark, Sweden, and Norway. Eventually, the Norsemen became Christians. Many simply took over the faith of those whom they had conquered and amongst whom they had settled. Furthermore, by the first half of the 11th century, almost all of Scandinavia had been baptized, so Christianity was spreading. The Hungarians, thus named because they reminded people of Attila and the Huns, Hungarian, attacked from the east. They settled in what is now Hungary, and missionaries from Germany and Slavic countries ventured into Hungary to proselytize. And in the 10th century, their king was baptized into Christianity. Because of all the warring and invasions, this time in history, particularly the 10th century, has been called a dark century of lead and iron. Lots of battles. Now wait, it gets worse. From 1099 to 1270, we see one of the most horrific blights in the history of the Christian church. Can anyone guess what that might be? The Crusades. The Crusades. The crusading spirit that swept Western Europe was so powerful, so overwhelming, and yet so contradictory. It was a difficult time in parts of Europe. Crops had failed and disease was running rampant. So when the call for soldiers of Christ to go to foreign lands went out, it was heartily received by both the lower and the upper classes. And over the course of 2 centuries, 7 crusades marched on the Holy Land. They were led by a desire to recapture Jerusalem, to unite the East and West once again, and in so doing, win heaven. Pope Urban II, the Pope to send the first crusade, said this to his people. "I say to those who are present, I command that it be said to those who are absent. Christ commands it. All who go thither and lose their lives, be it on the road or on the sea or in the fight against the pagans, will be granted immediate forgiveness for their sins. This I grant to all who will march by virtue of the great gift which God has given me." Wow. You march in the Crusades and the Pope guarantees you go to heaven. That was a pretty good deal. Well, the Holy Land was captured and the East and West united, but none of it lasted long. The Crusades were a bloodbath. Not only Muslim and European soldiers lost their lives, but also civilians. Whole groups of women raped and slaughtered, babies thrown against walls, not to mention the thousands of Jews killed along the way, as they too were considered infidels. In Jerusalem, during the First Crusade, many of the Jews living in the city took refuge in the synagogue. The Crusaders set fire to the synagogue and burned everyone inside. An eyewitness recounted how at the porch of Solomon, which is one of the entrances to the temple, horses waded in blood. The Crusades achieved little to nothing. The only countries successful in overthrowing the Muslims were Spain and the island of Sicily. The Crusades greatly impacted Christian thought. All that contact with the Holy Land turned people's attention to stories of the Bible, to the life of Christ and the humanity of Jesus. Similarly, veneration of relics from the Holy Land resurged. So relics such as the cross of Christ or fragments of it, bones of patriarchs that we would have known from the Bible, teeth of biblical figures flooded all through Europe. Europe experienced relative peace in the 12th century and came to be called the Golden Age of Christianity. But the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries were once again fraught with war and disease. With the rise of the merchant class, or the bourgeois, who supported the efforts of kings to curtail the power of feudal nobility, modern states arose. So France, England, and Scandinavian countries were the first to be united under strong monarchs. Spain followed later at the end of the Middle Ages, and Germany and Italy much later. Politically and militarily, the 100 Years' War between France and England dominated Europe during the 14th and 15th centuries. And this is also where we find that amazing figure, Joan of Arc, who was made the patron saint of France for her intervention in the 100 Years' War. The other event that set the stage for the life of the church in the later Middle Ages was the Great Plague of 1347. Bubonic plague, transmitted by fleas and rats, swept Europe and in 3 years wiped out approximately 1/3 of the entire population. The plague deeply affected the thinking of the populace. Since the outbreaks of the plague seemed to affect young people who had not developed strong immunities, the natural order of a rational universe came into question. It encouraged superstition, and fear was everywhere. Fear of plague, fear of hell, fear of being judged unworthy for heaven. It took about 100 years for Europe to recover from the plague. So, very dark days indeed. Now, let's turn our attention to the papacy and see what was going on for those 1,000 years in the papacy. After the fall of Rome in the 4th century, the papacy grew in authority and respect. The word pope itself means father and was used in earlier times to refer to any important and respected bishop. And although there are many medieval popes who greatly impacted the church, I'm only going to mention a few this morning. The first is Pope Leo. So under Pope Leo, or Leo the Great, the papacy gained much favor with the people. I think we've got some images of the popes. Awesome. Under Pope Leo, or Leo the Great, the papacy gained much favor with the people. So during the barbarian invasion in 452, Leo headed off an invasion of Rome by Attila and the Huns. So when the civil authorities, the kings in power at that time, were weak and proved unable to do their job, the church stepped up in the person of Leo the Great. He took an army and marched to meet Attila and the Huns before they could reach Rome to sack it. Justo L. Gonzalez writes, legend has it that Attila saw Saints Peter and St. Paul marching with the Pope and threatening the Hun. Whatever was said, Attila decided not to attack Rome that day and turned towards the north, where he died shortly thereafter. Then again, in 455, when Vandals attacked Rome, it was Leo who negotiated with them to not burn the city. The second influential pope is Pope Gregory, who was born in 540 AD and was one of the most able popes in the papacy. Gregory was a huge follower of St. Augustine of Hippo. We spoke about him a couple of weeks ago. He is that church father from North Africa that has greatly impacted the Western Church with his theological teachings. So Gregory studied closely the teachings of Augustine, but where Augustine hypothesized over ideas, Gregory sought to make certain. For example, out of Augustine's pondering, a place of purification where those who died in sin could spend time before going to heaven, Gregory took this pondering and claimed it with certainty. Thus, the doctrine of purgatory had its roots under Pope Gregory. He went further to claim that we who are still alive can offer Mass in favor of those in purgatory to help them get out of purgatory into heaven. He also believed that during communion, Christ was sacrificed anew each time communion was celebrated. There is a legend that the crucified Christ appeared to him one day while he was celebrating Mass. So this notion of Mass as sacrifice, or as we now know it as transubstantiation, which teaches that the bread and the wine served in communion become the literal body and blood of Christ. This eventually became standard doctrine in the Western Church in 1215, until it was rejected by the Protestants in the 16th century. After Gregory, the papacy fell on evil days, and for the next few centuries, so the papacy, reflecting these dark days and warring times, fell to the lowest depths of its entire history. During the barbaric invasions and Muslim occupation, pope succeeded pope in rapid sequence. Their history is one of intrigues too complicated to follow today, but each one of them was vying for power and finding creative ways to knock off their predecessor. Popes were strangled and poisoned and heads mashed in by mallets, or they died of starvation in dungeons where they had been thrown by their successors. At times there were 2 or even 3 popes, each claiming to be the one true successor of St. Peter. If you have ever seen the historical dramatic mini-series about the Borgia family, you'll have a sense of the level of corruption that was alive in the papacy at that time. Finally, in the mid to late 10th century, King Henry III of Germany intervened and deposed all the popes and elected Clement II. The church council at that time also enacted a series of decrees against church corruption, particularly simony, the practice of buying and selling positions in the church. So bishops and priests could no longer sell their titles to the highest bidder for their own gain. However, reform in the papacy came slowly. In 1048, a barefoot pilgrim named Bernot went to Rome on a personal act of devotion. As he crossed northern Italy on his way to Rome, multitudes lined the road and cheered for him. After entering Rome, acclaimed by the people and the clergy, Bernot accepted the papal tiara and took the name Leo IX. Leo immediately set about reforming the papacy along with another monk named Hildebrand. And Hildebrand would actually later become Pope himself. The 2 men attacked the same old issues of clerical celibacy and simony. In the end, the program of the reforming popes succeeded. The rule of clerical celibacy became universal in the Western Church and was generally obeyed. For a while, simony almost disappeared, but the power of the papacy continued to grow until it reached its height in the 13th century. The only reform not embraced by the reforming popes was the ideal of poverty. Mostly, this was due to the importance of all that money sitting in the church coffers. The civil authorities, especially the emperors, wanted to make certain of who would be pope. The church had become so powerful that an unfriendly bishop or pope was greatly feared. So the state kept a close eye on who was given power and who was not. And although the bishops and popes recognized that all the clerical possessions belonged to Christ and the poor, they were more often used for personal profit and for achieving the ambitions and the personal goals of bishops and others who were in theory not owners of these possessions, but guardians. At the end of the 12th century, Pope Innocent III became the most powerful pope in the history of Christianity. He was so powerful that he was able to interfere in the lives of the monarchy in Italy, England, France, and Spain. He was deposing some, forcing others to remain with their first wives rather than taking a second, and forcing the monarchs to make their kingdoms a fiefdom of the papacy. So this allowed all lands conquered from unbelievers to become property of the papacy. Wow. Not hard to see how the church became very wealthy. In 1378, there arose rival popes, one residing in Avignon in France and the other in Rome. Much of this situation was created by the intervention from the French monarch Philip IV. The rival popes each continued to assert their claim to the title until 1415, thus beginning to weaken the universal authority of the papacy. So we can see it start to decline a little bit. Now, finally, we're going to look at monasticism and see how that has changed over the 1,000-year period. So turning our attention to the other branch of the church, monasticism, we see tremendous growth and influence in the Middle Ages. Following the Desert Fathers and Mothers and the rise of communal monasticism under Pachomius, monasticism blossomed and expanded. One particular influential abbot was Saint Benedict of Nursia and his Benedictine Rule. Benedict lived from 480 to 550 AD and has been called the father of Western monasticism. Under Benedict, monasticism took on a very practical flavor. Benedict saw the purpose of monasticism as a mission to the world, and he sought ways to organize life in community, and monasteries came to be teaching centers, hospitals, pharmacies, hotels, or more like hostels, and cities grew up around these monasteries. I think we have a picture of some monasteries, actually. So these are real monasteries. I'm sorry, I don't remember where they are. But you can see how cities have developed right around the monasteries. And monasteries added vast amounts of agricultural land to the church as they farmed and grew their own food and food for their communities. The Benedictine Rule was written late in Benedict's life and became a guidebook for monks living in community for 15 centuries. So it's a very long-standing rule. Beyond its religious influences, the Rule of Saint Benedict was one of the most important works written to shape medieval Europe. So it was embodying the ideas of a written constitution and the rule of law. It also incorporated a degree of democracy in a non-democratic society, and it came to dignify manual labor, which really wasn't dignified at that point. Now, the mess in the papacy had forced most who took their faith seriously into the monastic way of life. However, monasticism itself was a little in need of reform, following all the invasions that had taken over Europe. So many monasteries had been sacked by the Vikings and the Hungarians, and some abbots actually went the way of the papacy, buying and selling their posts to the highest bidder. The Rule of Saint Benedict came to be ignored until around 800 AD, when Charlemagne, Emperor of Europe, had Benedict's rule copied and distributed to encourage monks throughout Western Europe to follow it as a standard. And then in 909, Duke William III of Aquitaine founded a monastery at Cluny and called on a monk named Bernot to run it. Bernot was steadfast in the Benedictine Rule, and thanks to a long series of extraordinarily able abbots, Cluny became the center for a vast renewal of monasticism that eventually made an impact on all of Western Europe. So this is a model of the monastery at Cluny in its day. The monks of Cluny and their sister and brother monasteries became known as the Cluny Acts. In the 11th century, when the call of Pope Urban II went out for soldiers to join the Crusades, the monasteries responded. Many monks embraced that crusading spirit and became warriors under the order of St. John of Jerusalem, which later came to be known as the Templars, an organization which continued long after the Crusades ended. As the Crusades were coming to a close in the 13th century, monasticism took on a different flavor. In response to the widening gap between the rich and the poor that the new growth of cities, trade, and the monetary economy brought, a new type of monk was born, the mendicant monk. Mendicant means those who live by begging. One of the most well-known mendicant monks at this time is Saint Francis of Assisi. Francis belonged to the merchant class and one day had a profoundly religious experience that led him to a life of poverty. It is said that one day his friends noticed he was exceptionally happy. "Why are you so happy?" they asked him. "Because I have married," he responded. "Whom have you married?" "Lady Poverty." He then gave all he had to the poor and forfeited his family inheritance for a life of poverty, preaching, and helping the poor and sick in the cities of Europe. Thus, the Franciscans were born, and they received papal approval. Other mendicant orders arose at this time, like the Dominicans, who believed strongly in education and teaching and learning and studying theology. And many of these orders continue to this day. So the medieval period is a very large chunk of history that saw much migration of people groups through the conquests, the establishment of independent state monarchies, and great growth in trade and the merchant classes. It saw the rise of scholasticism and universities, but it also saw the slaughter of thousands in the name of the church through the Crusades, the establishment of the oppressive feudal system, and the horror of the plague. Through it all, the church grew in power and wealth, gaining more lands and riches despite the many reforms imposed. So what do we take from this 1,000-year picture of history? Perhaps you know that old adage, money, sex, and power corrupt. Certainly we can see how the life of the clergy is plagued with corruption to this end. We have popes struggling for power, emperors trying to secure their roles through the church, power struggles everywhere, clergy using their positions for money to control and influence, sexual impurity among the clergy who were supposed to be holy, having more than one wife, and practicing synecticism, that term we learned a couple of weeks ago of spiritual sisters who lived under the same roof in supposedly chaste situations. A practice that lasted for the entire Middle Ages. The church had become so opulent through wars and crusades. They were selling salvation, selling the forgiveness of sins, creating the concept of purgatory, which is one of the best money makers the church has ever seen. Maybe you've heard of that oh-so-popular medieval phrase, "When a coin in the coffers ring, a soul from purgatory springs." How quickly the human heart abandons God for all the good things that he has created. But the human heart also has a cry to know God and to connect with God. We see in the continuation of the monastic movement a hunger for God, spiritual seekers looking to connect, people looking for a genuine spiritual experience, seeing through the corruption of the religious order of the day. And let's face it, nothing has changed today. We've all heard stories of preachers using Jesus to gain wealth and power, using their positions of influence for positions of selfish gain. And yet, we also know of many self-sacrificial pastors whose focus is genuine connection with God for themselves and for their parishioners. And even Paul in the New Testament noticed the same thing. In Philippians 1:8, he points out that there are those who preach for selfish gain, and yet he was happy that the gospel was preached. He says, but what does it matter whether their motives are false or genuine? The message about Christ is being preached either way, so I rejoice. So we see over and over, century after century, history is repeating itself. And who are we today? What is the purpose of our gathering here today? It is our hope and our prayer that we genuinely encounter God together as we worship him. So I encourage you this week to consider, in the greater scheme of Christianity over these 1,000 years, what do you take away? And how do you respond to our lives today in the 21st century? And it is our hope and prayers for myself and for all of you that we genuinely encounter God together as we worship him today. Amen.